"Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a real weapon system, not a jungle gym." The voice was young, sharp, and dripping with condescension. It belonged to a Marine Corporal, ramrod straight in his dress blues, who was addressing a woman standing near the formidable 5-inch deck gun mounted forward of the submarine's conning tower. Danielle Boyd didn't react. Her long blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, catching the sea breeze that swept across the historic naval pier. She wore a simple royal blue top and jeans, blending in with the small crowd of corporate guests touring the museum ship, the USS Stingray. The corporal had been leading their tour, his chest puffed out, enjoying the authority that came with the uniform. "Why don't you head down to the galley with the others?" he suggested, his gesture a clear dismissal. "They're talking about how they used to cook for 100 men in a space the size of a closet. Probably more your speed." Danielle's gaze remained on the gun. Her eyes, a calm and startling gray, traced the lines of the breech block, the traverse wheel, the elevation crank. A few people in the tour group shifted uncomfortably. The corporal's comment had landed with a thud. "I'm fine right here," she said, her voice even and quiet, carrying no hint of the sting in his words. The corporal, Miller by his name tag, took her quiet defiance as a challenge. He had been a Marine for 3 years, a guardian of tradition and discipline, and he saw a tourist who wasn't showing the proper respect for a piece of naval history, and by extension for him. He decided to make an example of her. He strode closer, adopting the patient, patronizing tone one might use with a difficult child. "Look," he began, pointing to the massive steel wheel on the side of the gun mount. "This is the traverse wheel. It takes 2 strong sailors, working hard, to move this 50-ton gun mount even a few inches. It's not a toy." Danielle's eyes met his for the first time. There was no anger in them, only a deep, unnerving stillness. "I'm aware." Her simple answer seemed to fuel his irritation. He saw her as a dismissive civilian, someone who couldn't possibly comprehend the world he represented. The world of strength, discipline, and steel. "Are you now?" he said with a smirk, crossing his arms. The tour group was now fully focused on the uncomfortable drama unfolding on the deck. "You know, this gun was the king of the surface battle in its day. Fired a 54-pound shell over 9 miles. To do that, the gunner's mate and his team had to be a well-oiled machine. They had to know every gear, every lever, every single pound of pressure needed to bring this beast to life." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone to hear. "It takes a certain kind of person to master a weapon like this. It takes grit." He was practically flexing, his entire posture a display of masculine pride. Danielle just watched him, her expression unreadable. She had faced down far more intimidating men than this puffed-up corporal, men whose threats weren't just words. He misinterpreted her silence as intimidation, or perhaps feminine awe. His smirk widened. The joke, he decided, was ready to be deployed. "Tell you what," he announced to the group, gesturing grandly toward Danielle. "Since this lady seems so interested, let's give her a shot. What do you say?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the onlookers. "Come on, ma'am," Miller said, patting the cold steel of the gun mount. "Show us what you've got. Let's see you try to move it. Just try to get it to budge." He was setting her up for failure, for a moment of public humiliation where she would struggle against the immense weight of the machine, proving his point about who did and did not belong in a world of weapons and war. He expected her to blush, to refuse, to shrink away. Danielle Boyd did none of those things. She simply nodded once, a small economical movement. She walked past him, her worn sneakers silent on the steel deck plates, and stood before the gunner's station. For a moment she just stood there, her hand hovering over the controls. The corporal prepared another witty barb, ready to comment on her hesitation, but she wasn't hesitating. She was remembering. Her fingers lightly touched the cold, weathered brass of the elevation wheel. The texture was familiar, a ghost of a sensation she knew not from a museum, but from the field. As her skin met the metal, the sunny pier fell away, replaced for a heartbeat by a landscape of dust and rock. The air was not salty and cool, but hot, dry and thick with the smell of burnt cordite. The weapon in her memory was not a silent 50-year-old deck gun, but a modern M777 howitzer, its barrel still smoking from the last fire mission. A voice, frantic and distorted by radio static, crackled in her ear. "Havoc, Maine. This is Dragon 6. We're taking effective fire. Danger close. I need immediate suppression on grid." And her own voice cutting through the chaos, impossibly calm. "Dragon 6, this is Havoc, Maine. On the way." The memory was gone as quickly as it came. A flash echo of a different life. Back on the deck of the Stingray, Danielle's hand closed firmly around the wheel. Her movements were no longer those of a curious tourist. They were fluid, practiced, and imbued with an authority that was utterly at odds with her casual appearance. She didn't just grab the traverse wheel and heave. First, her right hand went to a small, greasy lever near the base, the traverse lock. She disengaged it with a clean, solid clank that echoed across the deck. Corporal Miller's smirk flickered. He hadn't even mentioned the lock. Next, she placed her feet, not side by side, but in a braced, slightly staggered stance, finding the perfect point of leverage. She didn't pull with her arms. She put her entire body into the motion, her core engaged, turning from the hips. The massive gun mount, which a moment ago seemed like an immovable monument of steel, began to move. A soft gasp went through the tour group. It didn't jerk or shudder. It moved with a slow, deliberate, and perfectly controlled grace. The gears, stiff from decades of inactivity, groaned in protest, but they obeyed. With smooth, rhythmic motions, she swung the huge barrel a few degrees to starboard. Miller was speechless. His mouth was slightly agape. This was not supposed to happen. He had tried to move the gun himself last week with another Marine, and it had taken both of them grunting and straining to get it to shift. Danielle then moved to the elevation crank. With the same economy of motion, she began to turn it. The long, heavy barrel of the 5-inch gun began to rise, lifting towards the sky in a steady, controlled arc. She wasn't just moving it. She was operating it. She was performing a drill, her body a seamless extension of the machine. On the other side of the submarine's sail, leaning against the steel bulkhead with a cup of coffee, stood Chief Petty Officer Thompson. He was retired Navy, a submariner with 30 years of service under his belt, who now volunteered as a docent on the Stingray. He had seen the whole exchange with the young, arrogant Marine. He'd seen plenty of hot-headed youngsters in his day, but what he was seeing now was something else entirely. It wasn't just that the woman was moving the gun. It was the way she had checked the breech before touching anything else. A quick, almost unconscious safety check that was pure muscle memory. It was the way she used leverage instead of brute force. It was the focused, distant look in her eyes. It was the look of a gunner. Thompson had seen that look before. He'd seen it in the eyes of battleship gunners' mates, in the eyes of Marine artillerymen he'd transported, in the eyes of men and women for whom a weapon of war was not a museum piece, but a tool of the trade. The corporal, finally recovering his voice, stumbled forward. "Okay, that's enough. Ma'am, stop. You don't know what you're doing." The chief snorted into his coffee. "Oh, she knows exactly what she's doing, son. It's you who's out of his depth." He watched as Danielle brought the gun to a stop, its barrel now angled at a precise 20 degrees, pointed out at a specific spot on the horizon. It was a classic ready position. Thompson knew with a certainty that chilled him that she could probably lay this gun on a target a mile away in under 30 seconds. He set his coffee down. This had gone from an awkward social moment to something much more significant. The corporal was humiliating himself, but worse, he was disrespecting something the chief couldn't yet name but knew was important. He pulled out his cell phone. He didn't call security. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he used maybe once a year. It was the direct line to the protocol officer at the nearby Marine Corps base. A visiting full-bird colonel was on base today, a man named Vance, and he was scheduled to tour the Stingray this afternoon. The call was answered on the second ring. "Protocol, Sergeant Evans speaking." "Sergeant, this is Chief Thompson over at the Stingray," the chief said, his voice low but urgent. "I need you to get a message to Colonel Vance immediately. Tell him he needs to get down to Pier 4, right now." "Is there an emergency, Chief?" "Of a sort," Thompson said, his eyes still locked on the woman in the royal blue top. "There's a Marine Corporal down here making a complete ass of himself in front of a civilian tour group. And Sergeant, I think he's doing it to Captain Ghost Eye Boyd." There was a sudden, sharp silence on the other end of the line. The name had landed like a mortar round. "Say again, Chief. Did you say Ghost Eye?" "That's the one," Thompson confirmed. "Now are you going to get the colonel or not?" Inside an administrative building at the Marine base, a young lieutenant typed furiously at his keyboard, his face pale. Colonel Vance, a tall man with a severe haircut and the quiet intensity of a career infantry officer, stood over his shoulder, the phone still pressed to his ear. "Chief, are you absolutely certain?" Vance's voice was like gravel. "Sir, I spent 20 years on boats that had Marines embarked," came the reply. "I know the look, and I know the legend." The lieutenant's screen flashed, a personnel file appearing. He inhaled sharply. "Sir, I've got her. Captain Danielle Boyd, United States Marine Corps, inactive reserve, last billet, battery commander, 1st Battalion, 11th Marine Regiment, call sign, Ghost Eye." Colonel Vance's eyes scanned the screen, taking in the lines of text that summarized a remarkable career. 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, a Bronze Star with a V for Valor, a Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, a string of evaluations that used words like prodigy, unflappable, and the most technically proficient artillery officer I have ever served with. A special notation highlighted her cross-training with the Navy, marking her as one of the Corps' leading experts in naval gunfire support. She had on multiple occasions directed the fire of entire naval destroyers from a dusty outpost miles inland. Vance looked at his sergeant major who had entered the office upon hearing the commotion. The sergeant major's face was a mask of grim understanding. The name Ghost Eye wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend in the artillery community. A name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. "Sir," the lieutenant said, his voice barely a whisper. Her citation for the Bronze Star, she called in a danger close fire mission on her own position to break an ambush. The shells landed less than 50 meters from her. Vance's jaw tightened. He hung up the phone. "Sergeant Major, get my vehicle, get the command staff. We're going to the pier now." Back on the submarine, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Danielle had gracefully disengaged from the deck gun, returning the locks to their safe position. The tour group was silent, their amusement having curdled into a mix of confusion and dawning respect. Corporal Miller, however, was trapped. His authority had been publicly shredded by the very person he had chosen to make an example of. His face was a burning red mask of humiliation, and in his panic he made a final terrible decision. He chose to double down, to reassert his authority through the only means he had left, official procedure and threats. "Ma'am, that was an incredibly reckless and dangerous stunt," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "You are not authorized to operate this equipment. You have been tampering with a United States military artifact. That is a federal offense." He took a step toward her, puffing his chest out again, a desperate attempt to regain his lost stature. "I'm going to have to see your identification. I am officially detaining you until the base military police arrive to escort you from the premises. You are lucky you're not being charged with something more serious." It was the ultimate overreach. He was accusing a decorated combat veteran of a crime to cover his own wounded pride. He had pushed himself past the point of no return. It was at that exact moment that the sound of sirens, faint at first, began to grow louder, cutting through the peaceful harbor air. A few heads turned toward the shore. At the end of the long pier, a string of black government sedans and a white Marine Corps duty van screeched to a halt. Doors flew open with military precision. First out was Colonel Vance, his tall frame and crisp service uniform radiating an aura of absolute command. He was followed by his sergeant major, the young lieutenant, and a sharp-eyed female major from his staff. They didn't walk, they strode, their polished shoes striking the pier with a syncopated rhythm of purpose. The tour group, sensing the sudden shift in power, parted like the Red Sea as the command contingent marched up the gangplank and onto the deck of the Stingray. Corporal Miller froze, his threat dying on his lips. His eyes widened in shock and terror as he recognized the full-bird colonel insignia on the approaching officer's collar. He snapped to attention, his body so rigid it seemed it might shatter. Colonel Vance didn't even glance at him. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of flint, were fixed on one person only, the woman in the royal blue top. He came to a halt 3 feet in front of her. The sirens died, leaving a sudden ringing silence. Then Colonel Vance executed the sharpest, most profound salute of his career. It was not the perfunctory gesture offered to a junior. It was a deep, resonant sign of respect, an acknowledgement from one warrior to another. "Captain Boyd," he said, his voice echoing across the silent deck. "It is an honor, ma'am." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. "Captain, ma'am." Corporal Miller's jaw dropped. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly white. The entire tour group stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the unassuming woman with the rank and respect being afforded to her. Danielle, caught genuinely off guard for the first time that day, blinked. A flicker of the old command presence she thought she had left behind in the mountains of Afghanistan returned to her eyes. She straightened her posture, and though she was in civilian clothes, she seemed to grow taller. She gave a crisp, acknowledging nod. The colonel dropped his salute, but his intense focus remained on her. He then turned, his gaze sweeping over the stunned civilians, and finally landing, like a physical blow, on Corporal Miller. "For those of you on this tour," the colonel began, his voice a low rumble of command, "you have been privileged to witness something extraordinary today. You are standing in the presence of Captain Danielle Boyd, United States Marine Corps, though she is too humble to ever say it herself. I will." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This officer was known to us by another name, Ghost Eye. That wasn't a nickname, it was a promise. If you were a Marine pinned down by enemy fire, hearing her call sign on the radio meant that salvation, in the form of high-explosive artillery, was seconds away. If you were the enemy, It meant you were already a ghost and you just didn't know it yet. The crowd was rapt, listening with breathless attention. I personally know of a company of Marines who are alive today because Captain Boyd, from a command post miles away, used the guns of a Navy destroyer sitting offshore to walk a wall of shells up a mountainside, obliterating an entrenched enemy ambush. The papers called it a victory. The men on the ground called it a miracle delivered by Ghost Eye. He gestured toward the deck gun. When she laid her hands on this weapon, she wasn't a tourist playing around. She was a master craftsman recognizing a familiar tool. You didn't just see a woman move a gun. You saw one of the finest artillery officers of her generation paying her respects. His gaze finally returned to the petrified Corporal Miller. The temperature on the deck seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Corporal Miller. The colonel's voice was now dangerously quiet. You are a United States Marine. Your primary duty above all else is to embody our core values: honor, courage, and commitment. Your secondary duty is to recognize excellence and treat every single person in uniform or out with dignity and respect. Today you have failed in every conceivable way. You made an assumption based on appearance. You chose arrogance over humility. You belittled and attempted to humiliate a decorated combat veteran and an officer of the Corps you claim to love. You are a disgrace to that uniform. The rebuke was surgical, public, and devastating. Miller visibly wilted, his eyes fixed on the deck. You will report to my office, in your service alphas, at 0800 tomorrow, the colonel continued. At that time, you and I and the sergeant major will have a very, very long conversation about your future as a Marine. As the weight of that final sentence crushed the young corporal, Danielle stepped forward. Colonel, she said softly, if I may. Vance turned to her, his expression softening instantly. The corporal was just overzealous in his duties, she said, offering a lifeline to the young man who had tried to humiliate her. She then looked directly at Miller, her gray eyes not angry but instructive. Corporal, the standard is the standard. That's the only thing that matters. A gun doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. A fire mission has no gender. The enemy doesn't check your pronouns before they start shooting. All that matters is competence, performance. Learn to see that in people. Learn to see the skill, not the package it comes in. That's the only lesson here. Her wisdom, delivered without a trace of bitterness, was more powerful than any punishment. It was a lesson in true leadership. As she spoke, another flash echo, this one sharper, more vivid, came to her. The origin. She was in a cramped, dark forward operating base, the air buzzing with the sound of servers and radios. A chaotic firefight was playing out on the grainy drone feed on her monitor. A voice, young and terrified, was screaming into the net. We're pinned down, taking heavy machine gun fire from the ridgeline. We can't move. Danielle's eyes were locked on the screen, her focus absolute. She saw the muzzle flash, a tiny flicker of light in the gray landscape. Her voice, cutting through the panic, was as calm as a frozen lake. She read a string of coordinates into her headset. Fire mission. Grid 479er210. 1 round, Willie Pete. There was a moment of silence. Then she spoke 2 words. Shot. Splash. On the screen, the point of light vanished in a brilliant white phosphorus explosion. The screaming on the radio stopped, replaced by panting breaths of relief. A new voice came on the net, filled with exhausted awe. Jesus. Good kill, Havoc Maine. You're a damn ghost. A few weeks passed. The incident on the USS Stingray prompted a quiet but firm institutional response. A base-wide memorandum was issued by Colonel Vance, tactfully reminding all personnel of the importance of professional conduct and highlighting that veterans of all eras and conflicts walk among the civilian population in every form imaginable. A new mandatory training block on veteran interaction was added to the curriculum for all junior Marines on the base. It was led by the sharp-eyed female major who had been with the colonel's command staff. One Tuesday morning, Danielle was sitting in a quiet corner of a coffee shop a few miles from the base, sketching in a notebook. The bell over the door chimed, and in walked Corporal Miller. He was in civilian clothes, looking younger and far less certain of himself. He ordered a coffee, and as he turned from the counter, he saw her. He froze for a moment, and Danielle could see a war of shame and resolve on his face. He took a deep breath and walked over to her table. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "Captain Boyd?" Danielle looked up from her notebook. "Corporal, I just wanted to apologize," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were filled with genuine remorse. "Properly, without the colonel watching. There was no excuse for my behavior. I was arrogant, and I was wrong, completely." Danielle studied him for a moment, then gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit down, Miller." He sat, stiff and formal. "They reassigned me," he said. "I'm working with the new Marines, part of a mentorship program. Major Evans is my new OIC. She's tough and fair. I'm learning a lot. Good, Danielle said simply. Learning is the point. What you said, he continued, fumbling with his coffee cup, about the standard being the standard. It stuck with me. Major Evans says the same thing. She says leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the most competent. Danielle smiled, a small, genuine smile. She sounds like a good Marine. She closed her notebook. You made a mistake, Miller, a bad one, but it's what you do after the mistake that defines you. Don't just learn the lesson, live it, and maybe one day teach it. He looked at her, a seed of understanding beginning to sprout. Yes, ma'am, I will. He stood up, gave a slight respectful nod and walked away, leaving Danielle to her coffee and her quiet, unassuming life, a life built on a foundation of valor he was only just beginning to comprehend. The story of Captain Danielle Boyd reminds us that heroes don't always wear a uniform, and valor doesn't announce itself. If you were inspired by her story, hit the like button, share this video to honor our veterans, and subscribe to She Chose Valor for more incredible stories of women in uniform.